Hey everybody, welcome to this video. We are taking a little dive into Spark. So Spark is something that I'm using a lot in my day-to-day work, and it's just something that I think is really important in the data ecosystem these days. So we are going to branch out a little bit. We do a lot of these Tableau REST API tutorials and just Tableau tutorials in general. And I think it's important to not get stuck on one tool. So Tableau is a great tool for the job, but I feel like more and more in my career, the importance of where I'm working with data has definitely shifted to the back end. And when you get the data in the shape that you want, more of the kind of front-end-ish frameworks and front-end kind of tools like Tableau start to really shine, because at first, if you just use something like Tableau to do everything, you realize at some point you're kind of running against the wind, and there you get these over complex workbooks where you're really trying to use Tableau as an ETL tool at the same time it's your data visualization layer, and that can work, but there's a better world out there. So let's dive into this, because distributed computing is probably the future for any company that's really working with large volumes of data, if they're not already there yet. So let's dive in. And the approach we're going to take is we are going to be looking at stuff that you could build in Tableau, like maybe even something as simple as, a count of transactions per subcategory, which if you've worked with Tableau at all before, you're probably really familiar with this sample Superstore data set. So let's just have a little bit of fun here. Take a look at how we could build some really simple stuff in Tableau, and then see how that translates into the Spark syntax. How can you make this same information come to life in Spark? And the idea here is definitely not that this is we'd be working with data sets this small in Spark. That kind of doesn't even make sense. But this is more so to get you familiar with the syntax, kind of get you comfortable with working with this technology. So let's take a look at the environment we're going to be working in, demonstrating what we can do with Spark. And so first of all, we are using PySpark. So this is a Python implementation of Spark. And second of all, we are in a PyCharm IDE. So this is what I think is the best environment to work with Python in. And third of all, we are in a Jupyter notebook inside of PyCharm. So everything you're seeing me do here, you could easily do out in a Jupyter notebook outside of PyCharm. And I bring that up because in order to use a Jupyter notebook in PyCharm, you have to have the professional license, which I do, which I think is really valuable. It's really not that expensive if you really value the developer experience that comes with all of the features you get for paying JetBrains a little bit of money. Anyways, this isn't a JetBrains ad. This is all about how you can get familiar with the Spark syntax and kind of leverage something you might already know about, like Tableau data, Tableau Superstore data, in order to get there. So over here on the left, we have a really basic kind of project setup where we have some data, specifically this sample Superstore CSV, and then we have some little Jupyter notebooks where we're going to be accessing this data from. And just for starters, let's try to recreate this where we have this count of orders or count of rows, count of transactions per subcategory. Let's make that come to life first. And in order to do that, we're going to need to import some things from PySpark, specifically PySpark SQL. So PySpark.SQL import Spark session. This thing is what's going to really be our gateway into Spark functionality. So you can see down here, we're going to define a Spark session. We store that into this thing called Spark. And then we're just going to say, oh, I want to read in the CSV and I want to use Spark to do it. Well, let's just use that Spark session that we defined, and let's say spark.read.csv. So that's what this is doing. Then we import some functions. So PySpark.SQL import functions as f. You'll see in a bit why this is here. It's really going to give us some extra functionality while we're querying the data frame that results from reading in that CSV. So let's run this stuff, and while we wait here for our Spark session to get created, now keep in mind, if you're working with pandas on a CSV this size, this stuff would be like instant. But typically with Spark, you're going to be working in a distributed computing environment, not just reading from a CSV. So this overhead that exists here doesn't really make sense to take this cost when you're just working with something as small as a CSV file. But that doesn't really matter once you get to that scale of so much data that you couldn't even dream of playing around with that in a regular pandas environment. Or regular environment using pandas. So Superstore DF now exists. We have this thing. How can we look at what's in it? Well, we could say Superstore DF.columns, first of all. And looks like I made an enormous cell down here. So let's get rid of that. And just run this. Let's see. All of our columns are here. Okay, so that looks like everything that I recognize out there from the Tableau world. And now let's say Superstore DF.show. Let's show the top 5 rows, or just the first 5 rows Spark stumbles upon. And we can see all these columns are being reflected here, and we get the values for those as well. Okay, so at this point we have that data frame. We're able to see a little sample of it. Now, how do you start to kind of group your data by a dimension like we're doing out here with subcategory? So this is where things start to look a little bit SQL-y, which is kind of fitting because we're using this PySpark framework, and we have this SQL thing that we're importing. We're importing SQL functions. What does this all mean? Well, if you know SQL at all, then the kind of Spark syntax you're going to be using to query things is going to be really familiar to you. So let's see why this kind of has that SQL-ish theme. So we could say Superstore df.group by, and let's group by subcategory, and then let's just get the count. We say .count, and let's go ahead and run this. We can see what gets returned to us. It says, oh, you have a data frame now. Well, we actually want to show what's in that data frame. So let's go ahead and call .show. And now instead of just seeing that we had a data frame, we are going to get this output. So we could say, okay, envelopes, 254. Let's see, how many rows does envelopes have out here? 254. Okay, so far so good, but how do you go about sorting this in the same way that we see here? So we could come back out here and we could say, hey, I want to do some more to this, but it looks like my real estate here is kind of running short. So I'm going to suggest that we go ahead and put in some parentheses, and let's take what we have here and let's plop it in. And what these parentheses are going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to say, well, first of all, let's move .show here outside of those parentheses. So we're going to show whatever the result is of these modifications we do to the data frame within those parentheses. And then we can just kind of organize things, clean up shop here. So it looks like we're chaining these commands. We're saying, here's our Superstore DF. And as we move through these operations, that data frame is going to change. So we have our original data frame. Then we group it by something. Then we counted all the rows in there. And now we can see from out here that column for count is just named count. So if we wanted to order by it, we could add another little command here, and we can say order by count. Let's see what this looks like. So we get all of our subcategories, and indeed it is ordered by count, but it's not ordered in descending order. So now this is where some of those functions come into play. So if we wanted to sort this in descending order, so we want to do an order by, but count in descending order, we could say f.desc, which stands for descending. And this f dot pattern is something that we're going to see a little bit more in a minute. And this is something that's going to allow us to do all kinds of different functionality. Like if we see f dot, we get all these different kinds of functions that are kind of the PySpark SQL functions. So like if we wanted to do some array operations, or even if we want to do like sum, or let's see, date diff, or date trunk, or date format. These are all of those functions that we imported up here from PySpark.sql. Okay, so we have this thing order by count in descending order. Now let's see what that looks like. All right, we've got our subcategories, we've got binders, then paper at the top, and then we've got machines and copiers at the bottom. And we have binders and paper at the top out here in Tableau world, and then machines and copiers at the bottom. All right, so it's looking pretty good. Now let's just top this thing off by doing a little bit of extra. I don't want to drag this video too long. We can just do more videos down the road. But I do want to demonstrate how you can do things like adding columns to the data set, just like how in Tableau you could create calculated fields. And I also want to show how you can do aggregates within your group by. So out here we kind of cheat by calling .count, but there's more that we can do. We can kind of specify the aggregations, just like how in the Tableau land you can do a calculated field and you can say I want to take the sum of this, or how out in pandas you can say that you want to group by and then apply certain aggregations. Well, we can do the same thing in the Spark world. So once again, we're going to have these parentheses. We're going to say, give me my Superstore df, and let's just set the scene here of a target to shoot for. Let's say that we want to see our sales. We want to also know what the profit ratio is for each of these, be able to identify which of our subcategories might be having unprofitable profit ratios, and then filter this down to a specific year. In this case, 2020, and we also want to filter down to a specific shipping mode. And we're going to do all of that pretty quick here. And so let's start with the filters. So once again up here, I've got my columns, so we can see maybe first I want to filter on my order date. And to get to the year 2020, there's actually a bunch of things we could do. We could just filter on a date range. We could also create a new column where we actually convert our order dates into years. And just for simplicity, let's say we want the date range so that it's easy enough to, if we wanted to get more granular, we could easily just adapt this same approach to say, well, I want to see Q1 of 2020, and we know the exact dates that fall into that range. So let's just do it that way. Let's say .where, and then I want to filter on a column, but I want to use a smart way of defining a date range, which I just happen to know there's this between function where you can pass in a start and an end date. So let's make sure that we say I am filtering on a column, and this SQL functions f allows me to kind of treat a column in a specific way that kind of flags it as being a column and gives me access to all these different functions that we have. So if I specify I'm filtering on a column, then we can say which column. Here I'm going to say order date, and then because I'm saying f.call, I can do this dot, and we can see that there's all these different things, all these different operations I could do on a column. And what I want to do is get this between, and the lower bound's going to be my start date, upper bound's going to be my end date. So I'm going to say dot between, and let's say to get 2020, I define a range that's the January 1st up until 2020 December 31st. Okay, so that's one of our filters, and you know what? Let's just show the results of this really quickly. And we can kind of see how this changes as we go. So right now we have all these shipping modes, but it looks like our years now, we never see any date in there that's not 2020. Maybe if we scroll up, before we could see 2019 was in the picture. Now it's just 2020. Well, let's also come out here and let's make this filter for shipping mode. And this is supposed to just be first class. So let's say .where f.call ship mode. That's what that column's called. Ship mode equals first class. All right, now let's see what this is looking like. Okay, it looks like we're just getting first class. So this is how filtering works. You say .where, you can stack them on top of each other. You could also, if you wanted to, in one single .where, you could say like .where, something evaluates like to a certain condition. So like this date is between 2020, and then you could also say and some other condition. But it's also fine to just keep chaining these. And then let's see what else out here. Looks like we need to get this profit ratio. So in order to know what our profit ratio is, we are going to need to do an aggregate. So let's go ahead and do our group by subcategory, because we want the profit ratio at the level of subcategory. And now that we have our data grouped by subcategory, we could do a .ag. So up here previously we just did .count, which is kind of a built-in aggregation. But down here we could do .ag, and we can pass in here any kind of arbitrary aggregation we want to do. So let's just say we want to take the sum of our profit, divide that by the sum of our sales, and let's just see what this looks like. If I run this, I'm going to get this output that's giving me my profit ratios, and we can see down here only one of them is negative, and that's tables. If we come out here, we can see, okay, only one of these is negative as well, and that's tables. So a negative about 2% profit ratio. Out here we have about negative 2% profit ratio. Okay, so that looks right, but this is kind of hideous, right? You have a really ugly name. So let's go ahead and use this. We could say .alias and call this profit ratio. And if we run this, now this is kind of ugly still, and what went wrong here? We aren't aliasing this entire expression. So let's go ahead and wrap parentheses around this sum of profit divided by sum of sales and alias that entire thing as profit ratio. And now we're going to see, okay, here's my profit ratio. Now maybe to put things into context, we might also want our sales and the profit values. So let's just add those in. We could say f.sum of sales dot alias sales, and now we want to put commas separating each of our different aggregations. So f.sum profit dot alias profit, and let's run this. Let's see. Oops, no column named proft. Okay, so now we can get our sales, we have our profits, we have profit ratio, and at this point, I think we've covered, we've covered just the basics of the Spark syntax. We saw how we could read in data from a CSV file, how we could show the contents of the data frame, how we can do basic aggregations, how we can add in filters, how we could maybe even add in, let's add in a column. So I kind of hinted at this idea of how you could filter on dates. Let's just see if we wanted to, how we could filter on the year itself. So let's do one last thing before we wrap up this video, and that's going to be before we filter, we could say dot with column. So with column is going to basically be saying we want to create a new column, and that column name is going to be, let's say, year of order. And what this is going to do is it's going to be an f.date format, and we're going to format the order date, and the format that we're going to give it is just going to be year, 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 year. So anything that happened in 2020 should just come out as 2020. Anything that happened in 2021 will just come out as 2021, even if the original data, like up here, had the full year, 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 dash, month, month, dash, day, day format. All right, so let's say that now I just want to specify, instead of this, dot where year of order, and let me say f.call year of order equals 2020. All right, and we get the same results. Okay, so that's it. That's this kind of introduction to the PySpark syntax. And in future videos, we'll take deeper dives into this, but we'll also be mixing back into, we'll be doing a mix and match of the normal Tableau REST API stuff and how to use Tableau API lib. But we'll also be visiting this PySpark syntax because as this becomes a more and more important part of my day-to-day work life, I figure probably lots of other people in the data space, this is something that's becoming more and more important to them as well. And this is also going to open the door for us to discuss much more interesting applications of processing data and then feeding it into Tableau. For example, building models and running them in something like Spark, and then feeding the results into Tableau after outputting it to a data set. So let's just go down that road together, and I hope that this video is interesting to some of you who are trying to get into Spark, and hope to see you in the next ones. Thanks.